started before I forget. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the webinar this month. Before we get started, I want to make note that the webinar is being recorded. It will be available up on Eden's website and YouTube channel. Real quick introductions. I'm Claire Crum. I am Eden's Communications Coordinator. And today we are going to be hearing from Cheyenne Guidman, who is our Engagement Specialist at the Purdue Center for Regional Development with Purdue University. Cheyenne works very closely with a focus on intersection of communications and community development. And we're very lucky because she is our committee chair for our Community and Economic Development Committee here with Eden. So very excited to hear from you, Cheyenne. And whenever you're ready, we'll go ahead and get started.
Cool, thanks guys. As Claire said, my name is Cheyenne. I'm an engagement specialist with the Purdue Center for Regional Development. So while I am not technically Extension, we work very closely with Extension, and oftentimes our jobs overlap. And so we're great partners. My presentation style is more interactive, so I'm sorry you guys will be asked to participate. So I hope you're ready for that. To get started, will you guys drop your name, your institution in the chat box so we can see who all is on? And tell me, like, on a scale of 1 to 10, how familiar are you with the term digital equity? 1 being you've never heard it before, and 10 being you're an absolute expert. All right, I'm seeing a 4 and a 3, another 3. All right, great. So it sounds like you guys have heard it before. You might kind of know it, but hopefully I can teach you something today. So today with my presentation, my goal is to equip you guys with the terminology so that you can talk about it and have productive conversations. After that, we're going to get into how digital equity and disaster education intersect. So we're going to start with talking about why is this important to know? Why do we need to talk about digital equity? And then we'll get into that kind of terminology so that we are all on the same page. We know what these words mean, and we're all using them for the same thing. After that, we'll start exploring what is the digital divide and what does it look like when we're doing disaster education, as well as all the other phases of a disaster mitigation, recovery, all that good stuff. And then finally, I'm going to talk about how you can help and what you can do about the digital divide and help us work towards digital equity. There's some really cool things going on at the state level right now. So even though I'm not in your state, I can talk about generally what's going on across the US and give you recommendations on how you can get involved in your state more so. So with that said, let's get started. Let's talk a little bit about the digital age. Right now, currently, at this moment, we are living in the digital age. I know, it's mind-blowing. But I want you to take a second and think about how the digital age has impacted just your life today. Did you use an alarm on your phone to wake up? Did you listen to music as you got ready this morning? You all are on this Zoom. You all are using it for work. I would love it if you feel free to drop more examples in the chat, but the digital age touches so many different aspects of our lives, from healthcare to our economy, civic engagement, and communication. It touches everything. It overlaps with everything, and it's having an impact on everything. And that's why it's important that we start talking about this, because people who can't participate in the digital age, they can't participate in economy. They can't participate in those healthcare benefits. They can't get the same news and information that you and I get. Yeah. Amanda tracked her baby's food intake. That's so important. And so all these little things help and they add up. So the digital age is defined as the mass translation of information, products, and services into computer language at an exponential rate, infiltrating new areas of life and disrupting the world as we knew it. And so what's really important about this is that exponential rate. The digital age is happening very rapidly. We've seen massive changes in since it first started. I like to recommend people think about what it was like 10, 20 years ago when we were using Napster and Facebook was just getting started, and just thinking about those changes and how it has really impacted our life. Like Felicity, so that she uses Google Maps all the time. We used to have GPS systems, these big clunky GPS systems in our car, and now we just pull up on our phone and go. It's really impacting every area of our lives. But with it impacting in this rapid exponential change, we're seeing this digital divide emerge. And the digital divide refers to a gap between the internet haves and the have-nots. And so this has many layers to it, and that's what we're going to talk about more in the next session. But basically, the divide is the difference between people who have access to technology, who can afford it and know how to use it, versus people who don't have the access, they can't afford it, or they simply don't know how to use it. And so this is creating this huge divide within our nation and across the world. And so many people, like myself, are working on this through something called digital inclusion. Digital inclusion refers to the adoption of broadband technologies and its meaningful use for social and economic benefits. And so digital inclusion is the work we do to help people adopt technology, to help them find meaningful ways to use it. A lot of times in my work, that might be through economic development, such as helping small businesses use social media, figure out how to sell products online for those economic benefits. A lot of people work in telehealth and helping people adopt the internet, do digital inclusion work so they can have the access and the skills to access their care providers. And when people are on the wrong side of the divide, we call that digital exclusion. It's the opposite of inclusion. It's what happens when we're not working to actively bring those people in. So ultimately, with our digital inclusion efforts, what we're working towards is digital equity. And that is a condition in which all individuals and communities have the information, technology capacity needed for full participation in our society, our democracy, and our economy. And that list could go on and on. That definition comes from the National Digital Inclusion Alliance. They're a great organization. They do a lot of great work. And so if you're looking for a community similar to Eden, they go beyond extension though. But it's similar to Eden, and it's digital inclusion focused, and it's not just extension practitioners. It's not an extension organization, but they do a lot of great things. So if you're looking for a group to get involved with, I would recommend starting with them. Now, I know that was a lot of terms all thrown at you real fast. So let me summarize it real quick for you. Again, with this great graphic from the NDIA. Digital divide is the issue. It's what we are working on. We work on that through digital inclusion. Digital inclusion is the work we're doing to solve the digital divide. At the end, what we're aiming for is digital equity. That's our ultimate goal. Does that make sense, everyone? Following along? All right. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat box. I'm trying to keep my eye on that. But now that we all have the same terms, we're going to talk about how the digital divide and disaster education play into one another. We're going to do that by talking about the digital divide and special and the layers to that and what that looks like more specifically. And then we'll talk about how that plays into disaster education. Before I get into the levels of the digital divide, though, I want to talk about some socioeconomic barriers. These on my screen are barriers that have been identified through research that impact whether, or the great predictors about whether or not people will adopt technology. It's age, education, income, and disability. So people of an older age, people who are less educated, people with lower incomes, people with disabilities are less likely to be using technology. And so a lot of times these are the groups that we target because we know that they have additional barriers. And I know extension, there's a lot of overlap in some of our other programming. And so that's really why I wanted to call it attention to these. But moving into the digital divide. As you remember, the digital divide is a gap between the internet haves and have-nots. But I like to think of the digital divide like an onion. As you peel back layers, you find more and more issues. You have this level 1 surface stuff, which is access and adoption. And once you solve that, you get people devices and whatnot. You pull that back and then you have digital skills. And then you pull that back and you have something called digital capital. And we're going to go through these next couple slides and dig into these a little bit more, starting with this first level, the surface level. So the first level of the digital divide is about access and adoption. It's that yes, no, do you choose to adopt? Do you choose to use technology? And a lot of times when I'm talking to communities, both rural and urban, we hear, well, I don't need internet. That's just for Netflix and gaming. And that's a mindset we come up against a lot, that people don't see the potential benefit that the internet and technology can have. And so they're missing out. And so we all have free will, we all have rights in this country, and so I can't force someone, but I do want to make sure that they're making an educated decision, that they know the potential, and that they are making that decision while knowing what they're missing out on. This first level also gets into access, so that could be home access, having high-speed internet to their home, or having a place that they can go to, public libraries, internet cafes, where they can go to get that access. And then in addition to that, we have device ownership. And that device ownership goes hand in hand with home broadband access. And sometimes if they don't have device ownership, that's where we get to those public access sites and places where they can access devices. Again, public libraries are a great resource for that. While we're talking about the first level divide, a lot of times people focus on the infrastructure side of things. Now, that's not so much our focus here today, but I do want to at least give you guys enough information to know why that conversation is important. Currently, the FCC benchmark for what technically broadband speeds for a home is 25.3. That's 25 megabytes download, 3 megabytes upload. But there's a lot of conversation going on that it should actually be 120. Now, these may all just seem like numbers, but these numbers represent how much data can go from the home up into the cloud and from the cloud back into the home. And where we see these numbers get more context is when we talk about what's necessary, the minimum download speeds I have listed on the side for what is necessary to do these like common activities. And so you can see each of these, they don't take a whole lot. But when you start talking about a household that has parents working from home and multiple students doing e-learning, this starts to paint a different picture. Even if people aren't working from home or aren't e-learning, when you have multiple people using the same internet access, then you start seeing these numbers compile on one another and you start needing higher, faster speeds. While we are on the infrastructure topic, there's also a lot of discussion about different kinds of infrastructure, fiber, cable, satellite. A lot of that is very political and beyond my pay grade, so I'm not going to touch about that too much right now. I will bring it back in later conversations. But just so you know, when you hear people talk about it, this is what that conversation is about. So if we talk about the first level divide in terms of disaster education, we can think about and how the digital divide impacts disaster education. It impacts people's, if there's a digital divide, it will impact the access to devices after disaster. Now, as many of you know, that becomes important because a lot of the paperwork and response stuff that you need to do is online. A lot of FEMA has moved online, all that stuff. And so if they don't have a device before or after the disaster, whether they had one before and lost it in the disaster, or they didn't have one to begin with, that's part of that divide. Access to the internet, that's another example. The reason I brought up the infrastructure before is we need to think about the long-term impacts to infrastructure that disasters have. And so that's where disasters then play on the digital divide. Some technologies are more resilient than others. That's just a fact. And so we need to be thinking about that when we have certain areas that see certain disasters, such as hurricanes, flooding, tornadoes, some of those, how do those impact that infrastructure? And are we building infrastructure that's going to last? That's a question for the engineers. But that's something we need to be bringing into the conversation. And I'm not always sure that that's brought into the conversation to the level it needs to be. Because not having that access and adoption after a disaster can impact families economically. It can impact their social connections, their ability to reach family and friends and all that good stuff. The list on this slide is just an example, just some of the examples I came up with. I know many of you have much more experience with disasters. So if you have other ideas, please, as we go along, drop them in the chat. I'd love to keep this conversation going even as I'm talking. So the next level is about digital skills. Digital skills are the specific skills allowing for the use of digital technology. And digital literacy is the understanding or fluency with digital technology, allowing for adoption and use. A lot of times you see digital skills and digital literacy used interchangeably. But we're seeing a lot more shift in using the term digital skills. There has been some pushback on this idea of digital literacy, especially when we're using the term literacy. That can really turn off some of the populations we work with, saying, oh, well, you don't have good digital literacy. It's just a sort of topic. So a lot of people are moving towards using digital skills. We're also seeing in the conversation this idea of digital fluency coming up. And you see that in the digital literacy definition here, and understanding or fluency with technology. We're also seeing the idea of digital resiliency. I know we all get frustrated when our computers decide to update and where changes where things are and whatnot. But many of us have that digital resiliency to still be able to figure it out and find where things are. Some people, though, once things change, they have no idea how to use that program anymore. And so we want to make sure people are resilient. They're able to take the digital skills they have and evolve them and grow with them, especially as technology, which changes at an exponential rate. As it evolves, we want to make sure that the people using it are able to evolve and change with it too. Otherwise, they're going to miss out. So the digital divide, when we talk about digital skills and literacy, many different researchers have tried to categorize and put these skills into different categories. And I have a few examples on the screen here. But at the end of the day, you could break down skills into many different ways. And I have further examples on this next slide, but like I was saying, we really want to build in people digital resiliency, and that comes back to basic or transferable digital skills. And those are skills like how to turn the computer on, how to navigate the internet through an internet browser, and knowing how those basic things work. And making sure that they have those strong foundational skills. Now, I know I touched on this a little bit at the beginning, but when we talk about the second level of the digital divide, we also have to talk about digital immigrants, digital natives, and digital fluency. I already touched on digital fluency a little bit, but as I was saying earlier, think about how the internet has evolved from when it was first started in the 80s, and you saw the first domain name registered and the internet really becoming public, in the World Wide Web, all the way to now. In those 20 so years, we've had people who have grown up with the internet, and those we call digital natives. Those are people who grew up with technology. They've learned to use it from a young age, and so they have a very different understanding than people who did not, people who are coming into it, those late adopters, which we often call digital immigrants. And so there's the difference of digital fluency there and all those good things. So where the second level intersects with disaster education. It could be about how they can find and how they can navigate to find resources after a disaster, or even before a disaster, and how to become prepared. Knowing how to use the internet or where to find information, those are valuable digital skills that can make the difference between how prepared someone is, or being able to find the proper resources after a disaster so they can properly clean their home or get the financial help they need. I've seen a lot of conversation coming up within Eden about cybersecurity, knowing how to avoid cybersecurity threats and keep yourself safe. Those are digital skills. And those are things to also be thinking about. Digital skills even go into being able to find a job, find a new job after a disaster, or having the skills needed for a career move. You know, a lot of us are using Word, Excel, PowerPoint, but not everyone does. And so those skills could determine whether or not they're able to make career changes and get into different jobs or not. So again, this list is not exhaustive. Feel free to add to it in the chat as we're going through. But we're going to move on to the third level of the digital divide. And the third level, this one's a little bit more abstract. It's a little harder to wrap your head around. But it's known as the gap in offline benefits. Sorry, the slide is adapted from one about workforce development. So this is specifically about a gap in offline benefits received by members of the workforce. It could be anyone, but those examples are for the workforce. I know I see on here a couple different CED educators, and so you guys might be familiar with community capitals, even our non-CED educators. And so I have on the slide the community capitals, and so sometimes we think of the digital capital as another community capital. But at the end of the day, digital capital is the combination of digital skills and the digital resources to be able to create that digital capital. I know it's very abstract. But the key to focus on is those offline benefits. So when a disaster happens, a divide in digital capital could be the access to those social connections you make online. People aren't on Facebook or not being able to get on Facebook or social media. They may not be able to communicate with family, friends, either in their town or far away. So they lose that offline benefit of social connections. After a disaster, a digital divide might be unable to manage their bank account and bills and stuff. And so there could be financial implications for it. So thinking about these are what we mean by offline benefits. Like I said, this is a much more abstract and normally only talked about in research terms, but I think especially as we see using digital inclusion efforts for economic development purposes, we'll see this come up more and more, because at the end of the day, it's that offline benefit that is our bottom line. So as you can see from all of this, disaster education and the digital divide and digital inclusion have a lot of intersection. On the slide, I have a few more examples about thinking about the digital divide in terms of the disaster cycle, preparedness, response, recovery, and mitigation. And these are all things for you guys to be thinking about as you do your disaster education work, and keeping in mind what impact the digital divide has on your work. All right, so now we're going to get into the fun part. So what can you do about this? You're out, you're doing the Lord's work, you're doing a great job, you're educating people, you're helping them get prepared, you're helping them recover from disasters. What can you do? How can you keep the digital divide in mind and help mitigate that impact? Well, I'm a little biased, so first I have to start with giving a huge shout out to public libraries. Public libraries do a lot of great work in this area, from providing people with access through having computers there, having public Wi-Fi, to device lending programs, hotspot lending programs, digital skills classes, and so much more. So they are always a great resource in your community to start with and to work with. But I also want to make you guys aware of some legislation that's going on and some work that's actively going on in your states right now that is probably stressing some people out in your state a lot. And the first of those is the Digital Equity Act. So with the Digital Equity Act was passed last year. It creates 3 different programs. And its goal is to focus on creating digital equity in the US. So those 3 grant programs are the State Digital Equity Planning Grant Program, the Digital Equity Capacity Building Grant Program, and the Digital Equity Competitive Grant Program. So these first 2 are tied together. And right now, everyone's working on the State Digital Equity Planning Grant Program. So what that is every state, and not just states, we have every state, territory, and tribal, I believe, all got money to write a digital equity plan, a statewide digital equity plan. And there are a lot of conditions put on that, but such as certain covered populations that have to be addressed in that plan. Every state is having to do listening sessions, gather information. And then once those plans are written, that's where those capacity building grant program comes in, and the states are going to get money to implement those digital equity plans. So this is one way where you guys could be getting involved. Figure out who in your state is writing that digital equity plan. A lot of states that is led by the state broadband office. And then in other states like Louisiana and Indiana, that has been kicked over to universities, and those are the people leading the charge in partnership with the state broadband office. The Illinois Innovation Lab is another example of a university that's working closely with the state broadband office to do that. Now, not every state is working with the university. Some are doing it in-house. Some of them have hired consultants from the private sector to help work on that. But regardless, there is a heavy requirement on gathering data, both secondary data like census data, surveys, interviews, that sort of thing, and doing public listening sessions. So there's an opportunity for you guys to get involved and be like, hey, have you considered disaster work? Have you considered digital equity when it comes to preparing for a disaster? Have you considered it when it comes to mitigating a disaster? I know in the CED committee, there's been a lot of talk about COADs and response and needing those digital navigators, people who are trained to help people navigate the internet after a disaster, having those specifically trained people come in and help people fill out the paperwork they need and do all of that great stuff. So bringing that to people's attention. I know sometimes there can be laws or we have rules at our universities about lobbying, and this is different because this is more about public input and just being like, hey, have you looked at this data or looked at it from this point of view? So please, they are doing their best to reach as many people as they can, but sometimes, as I'm sure many of you know, when you're doing those listening sessions, it can be like pulling teeth. And I am going to be honest, I'm a little biased here because I'm helping write our digital equity plan. And so I am knee deep in all this. Now, this third part of the Digital Equity Act, the Digital Equity Competitive Grant Program. So whereas the capacity building grant program is going to be grants available to implement the statewide digital equity plans, this third grant program is going to be a pot of money that will be a national grant program to address digital equity issues. So this is a great opportunity. I know a lot of times in Eden, we have multi-state partnerships that are working on big projects, and this would be another opportunity for funding. They have not released the RFP or what all is going to be required of that for that program. There's a lot of listening sessions going on by NTIA as they're trying the National Telecommunications something. It's an office under the U.S. Department of Commerce that is really heading and spearheading these grant programs because they're trying to figure out what that RFP is going to look like. They're deciding criteria and all that. But I encourage you guys to look at their website to take note of that, because that could be a great funding opportunity for if anyone wanted to do any sort of project related to digital equity and disaster education, or a digital equity project in general. But as I was saying, with those statewide digital equity plans, there's certain covered populations that those have to address. And I wanted to call attention to those on the screen because a lot of those are the same groups or the same covered populations that Extension serves, especially this last bullet point here. Oops. Great. Individuals who primarily reside in rural areas. I know that's like Extension's bread and butter is rural areas, and those are their own specific covered populations in the Digital Equity Act. So the experience that you guys have working in rural areas, being able to share those experiences and those stories with people writing your statewide digital equity plan is crucial. It can make a world of difference. The other program that I want to draw your guys' attention to is the BEAD program. BEAD stands for Broadband Equity, Access, and Deployment Program. So whereas digital equity is kind of sometimes seen as more social justice, it's more all-encompassing of everything we've talked about today, the BEAD program is much more targeted and focused on infrastructure. These are also statewide plans, as well as given to a couple of different territories in the US. And so states are actively working on this BEAD plan to figure out how they're going to address the infrastructure gaps in their states, and what that looks like. So that's another place that you guys can get involved, and you can reach out and say, hey, a lot of the BEAD plan is also has to host community listening sessions and whatnot, and the BEAD plan and the digital equity plans are required to integrate and to work together. But that's something else to be aware of that's going on at your state levels. So what else can you guys do? These are just a few ideas, just a couple low-hanging fruit, but you can reach out to your broadband offices, as I said, and work on and get involved on these plans. Consider the impact of the digital divide when you're developing mitigation plans. Be aware of the impacts of the digital divide during recovery, especially when we're thinking about long-term recovery and how that might impact beyond the individual level, small businesses, nonprofit organizations, and all those different groups. They may need additional help overcoming the digital divide. And addressing the digital divide and preparedness recommendations. So realizing, I know a lot of us put out preparedness tips and tricks through social media, but that's not going to reach everyone because of the digital divide. And so while that's an absolutely great solution, I love it, don't get me wrong, we also have to be aware that not everyone is online. And so how else can we be reaching these people? There's also preparedness recommendations especially for things like small businesses on backing up their files, having those necessary documents backed up, and not everyone has those skills. So how can we help them navigate those instances? And with that, that's all I have for today. So I'd love to open up the floor for any questions or any further conversation you guys want to have about the intersection of these two very deep, wide topics.
Cheyenne, do you have anything like, small one-pagers or social media graphics or something for those of us in Extension that are trying to help other organizations understand this as they, look at membership and engagement and stuff like that? Is there anything that you have to support, the research and the work that you've done that we can utilize and help get out? Claire, did she freeze, you think?
I think we lost Cheyenne.
Oh, well, hopefully she jumps back on and I can
I think
re-ask
she'll
that
jump back
question.
on. Yes, that's a good one. I'm definitely interested in getting some graphics as well and utilizing them for Extension. Kind of fitting that she's gonna potentially lose some internet connection during this conversation.
It had to happen.
It had to, yeah. There's no way around it.
And the fact that she's on campus cracks me up.
It's always like that. Well, while we're waiting for Cheyenne to jump back on, if there are any other questions, or does anybody have anything they want to add to share an experience with maybe something they've experienced with digital equity and inclusion, especially during times of disaster? I know personally this is not something I'm familiar with, besides since I was a student during COVID, it was brought to our attention a little bit of when we started working from home. And very clearly, some students had great connection and some students could not finish their final exams. And that was the first time it really was brought to my attention. So definitely interested to pursue this. Let's see. Hi, David.
Hi, I'm eager to have her come back, but in the meantime, so one of the things that I work on with some other folks is technology called low power wide area network, which is related to the Internet of Things, which I think is part of the digital divide. The reason I got very interested in it was because it had the potential to serve rural areas, not with broadband access, but with other kinds of digital services, particularly around, in this context, I would say particularly around monitoring things like heat, temperature, fire danger, flood risk, those kinds of things. And I'm kind of interested in whether that has fit into this definition of digital equity. I know that the Extension Foundation, for example, released a study a year or two ago about half a dozen or more different kinds of sort of technological innovations that were sort of part of this, and Internet of Things was one of them, one of many. Anyway, I'm just wondering how that might fit in, particularly in a hazard Eden kind of context.
Cheyenne, can you hear us?
I have joined through my phone, so I only caught the last bit of that. My whole computer has decided to freeze, so this is fun.
Of course it has.
Yeah.
Well, if you can hear us, David, do you want to
Oh, there was that other question first. We might go there first.
Yes, Amanda had a question and David shared as well. So, Amanda, do you want to ask Cheyenne now that
Yeah, I
she's done?
can hop back on. So Cheyenne, do you guys have graphics or one pagers, or as we work in our communities with extension and we try to explain this situation to groups that we work with as they, you know, think about their engagement and their clientele, are there things that we can use to help bring this attention?
For the most part, Roberto Gallardo is my boss here. He's the director of my center, and he's been doing this work a lot longer than I have. We've been mostly doing these presentations like this word of mouth. That's where we've seen the most impact. NDIA, the National Digital Inclusion Alliance, they have some graphics and stuff. And so you might check their website. They have a whole catalog of free resources and stuff like that. But sometimes this is just such an abstract concept, it's hard to explain. We do have a few videos with Purdue Extension Community Development for our Digital Ready Businesses program that kind of start to explain this idea too. But those are the resources I can tell you about off the top of my head.
Would you guys have any plans to maybe develop some, at least to start a few topics to drive people to understand and learn more?
I think that might be a great thing that I can do with the community, the CED committee, especially. I think David K was asking about this in reference to mitigation plans. So it might be good to start with creating some of these one pagers for people as they're going into these communities and working with COADs and stuff. So I think Eden would be the great place to start with that.
Look forward to it. Thanks. I had a
Thank you.
meeting before this one where that would have been very handy because an individual at the state house really needed to see it.
Yeah, I understand.
And Cheyenne, that might be something, some graphics we can talk about in our next CED meeting, is maybe Eden can whip up some graphics.
Yeah, sounds good.
And then David, did you have anything else to
Sure,
add
Cheyenne, my question is, I've been working with a group trying to take a kind of deep dive into the kind of under the very broad label of Internet of Things, but really looking at low power wide area network technologies that are not good for, I mean, they're not a replacement in any way, shape, or form for broadband access and many of the kinds of things that you're talking about. But in the context of Eden, they're extremely good at providing connecting networks of sensors and to look, you know, in low served areas to the internet wirelessly at low cost. And I was just kind of wondering whether in the work that's being done within Eden or that you've been thinking about, there's thought about the role of, you know, like I've heard about applications for flood monitoring, wildfire risk, all of those kinds of sort of like risk monitoring, and to some degree potentially also you know, because it's a two-way messaging system, there could even be some ways of getting some messages out through the system which doesn't require broadband and is cheap.
Yeah, I think those conversations are just starting to come up, especially more and more in our disaster response. What I find a lot of times in my work is people don't understand what the difference between those sorts of things are and broadband. People don't even understand whether or not they have broadband. A lot of people are like, I'm connected to the internet, I'm good, that's broadband. And that's not always the case. And so there's a lot of education that's needing done. And I know some of that is supposed to be getting rectified a little bit with internet providers are going to be required to have these broadband nutrition labels, and that will help somewhat, but even then people will need help understanding what those terms mean and everything. And so I think those are conversations that are happening right here, right now, and that we really need to focus on. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, it raised the other question about what those labels are that you referred to.
I believe NTIA is still figuring all that out.
Okay.
It was part of the IIJA Act, the Investment in Infrastructure and Jobs Act. I think that's what the A stands for, but regardless, I think that's all still being flushed out. Any other questions?
Well, if nobody, I'll wait a second, but if nobody else does, I wouldn't mind some more examples of, if you have them, of sort of Eden specific or disaster preparation or mitigation response specific. You mentioned a few, but if you have more examples of sort of like how this could work and sort of, you know, what Eden would ideally like to see happen, I'd be interested in hearing that.
Yeah, so one example that comes to mind that we've done, not with Eden, but with a different program here at Purdue, is looking at connections and communication networks and figuring out, okay, if something were to happen, what's the best way of getting the word out? Maybe it's something as simple as a road closure, or people need to avoid a certain area. Mapping out those either social networks, if social media is the best way in a community, or maybe it's a newspaper, you know, figuring out where those hubs of community information are, what those networks look like, and how can those be leveraged and used in an emergency or disaster situation.
Thanks.
Any other questions for Cheyenne?
The
Cheyenne-
other example,
Oh, go ahead.
sorry, I was going to give David another example since there weren't other questions. We have digital fellows throughout the state of Indiana, and those are AmeriCorps service members who we placed in regions to work on digital inclusion issues. And one of the things that they're bringing back to us quite a lot, which is very concerning, is that a lot of our a lot of our local governments, whether county or city governments, don't know some of those basic cybersecurity rules, like how to create safe passwords or effective passwords, and how to store and manage those passwords, and just little cybersecurity things like that. And I know cybersecurity is coming up as a big topic in Eden, and I think we need to look at that beyond just farmers, which again, very important. I know that from our USDA NIFA FATI funds, that's one of the groups we need to look at, but some of these smaller communities that don't have a lot of resources also need that help in cybersecurity with things as basic as passwords and strong passwords and passwords management and that sort of thing. Any other questions?
Cheyenne, I definitely agree with what you just said, though, about in the extension offices. I recently met with some extension educators who, you know, everything record keeping is going online, 4-H online, lots of online programs for the county health and wellness, and the educators themselves aren't sure how to operate the passwords and the Zooms and how to get the programs up and running. So definitely something to explore about. If they're going to be potentially teaching in the community, there might be some stuff that they need to learn as well. Yeah.
Absolutely, yes.
All right. Any more questions for Cheyenne? Cheyenne, would you mind dropping